The year is 1942. Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Groves of the United States Army Corps of Engineers sits across from the brilliant theoretical physicist Robert Oppenheimer, smoke bellowing from Oppenheimer's third cigarette in half an hour. Oppenheimer, his face the picture of painted sincerity, tells Groves the Nazis no doubt have their own atomic bomb project, and Werner Heisenberg, a phenomenal nuclear physicist, will lead it. If we don't move fast, they'll have the bomb before us. We need to act right now. At that moment, the die was cast. Oppenheimer's fate to become the father of the atomic bomb was sealed. But just how close were the Nazis really to building that bomb? Did it become a neck-and-neck race between Oppenheimer and Heisenberg? And what were the Soviets and the Japanese doing during this race? Not everything was as it seemed. Today, you'll hear the bigger story, which was much more interesting and, to be frank, much crazier than the Oppenheimer narrative we've heard so much about lately. Oppenheimer was actually just one piece, albeit a big piece, in the vast jigsaw puzzle that is the story of the creation of the atomic bomb. To understand the Nazis' prerogatives, we need to understand what was going on in the world. So we'll start our story in London, the UK, where a Jewish, Hungarian, German-American physicist named Leo Szilard is walking down a road known as Southampton Row. He's just moved to England. The main reason for that is the extremely anti-Semitic Adolf Hitler has just become the Chancellor of Germany. Get out while you can, Szilard has told other scientists. The year is 1933, it's September 12th. Szilard is 35 years old and he's about to have a moment of disturbing clarity. On this walk, he's thinking about an article he's just read in the Times newspaper. It featured a speech given by Ernest Rutherford, a pioneering New Zealand-born physicist who would later become known as the father of nuclear physics. Rutherford is also now living in Britain, a country at the center of the golden age of physics. The Times article was headlined, "Rutherford Cools Atomic Energy Hope," with the subheading, "Sees moonshine in the talk at present of releasing power in matter." By moonshine, he meant poppycock, bullcrap, not true. It was not possible, he said, that humans could utilize atomic energy, meaning using it for practical matters. Not yet, anyway. The article talked about scientists smashing the atom, where, said the story, incredible energy is concentrated. Szilard keeps walking. He knows all of this, of course. His mind hasn't stopped working overtime since he read Albert Einstein's 1905 paper, "Does the inertia of a body depend upon its energy content?" Einstein proposed you could turn energy into matter, just as you could turn matter into energy. Unbelievable amounts of energy. In the Times article, Rutherford said with the processes they have now, you couldn't get great power from matter. His exact words regarding recent experiments with protons and a particle accelerator were, "It was a very poor and inefficient way of producing energy, and anyone who looked for a source of power in the transformation of the atoms was talking moonshine." Szilard then stops at some traffic lights at Russell Square. His mind is on fire. Stars explode, cities burn. He imagines a nuclear reaction producing neutrons. Neutrons had only just been discovered by the British scientist James Chadwick, a man you'll hear about again later in the show. Szilard sees the nuclear reaction producing more neutrons, which then causes more nuclear reactions, and he wonders why this would stop. It wouldn't, he thinks. There would be a nuclear chain reaction. He walks across the street and halfway he realizes something terrible. The huge amount of energy could be turned into a weapon, a bomb like the world has never seen. It would be an atomic bomb. This was a theory, of course, but he believed it could happen. It wasn't moonshine. Szilard patented his idea of a nuclear chain reaction in 1936. That is a huge piece of the jigsaw puzzle. It wasn't until 1938 that another very big breakthrough came. Nuclear fission was discovered. You take the nucleus of a uranium atom, into which a neutron collides to create two smaller nuclei. This process creates massive amounts of power, but what's important is more neutrons are created in the process. And just as Szilard had theorized, the reactions could become self-sustained and create a huge amount of energy. Notably, some of these scientists worked at the Kaiser Wilhelm Society for the Advancement of Science in Germany. Einstein had worked there in the past. During the war, vile human experimentation on Jewish people was part of the work there. Germany was at the center of the scientific world, and under Hitler that meant danger. You also need to know that when the Nazis took control of Germany, many scientists hit the road. Some were blacklisted, such as Fritz Strassmann, who was one of the 4 people who developed nuclear fission. He once said he'd rather die than know his work had helped Hitler make an atomic bomb. Not every German scientist was of that kind of opinion. 2 of the other scientists were Otto Hahn and Lisa Meitner. Hahn, sometimes called the father of nuclear fission, didn't jump ship out of Germany like many others. In fact, in 1933, long before the full extent of Hitler's violence was understood, Hahn told a Canadian newspaper, "In any case, for the youth, for the nation of the future, Hitler is a hero." So, the father of nuclear fission was a Hitler fan. Don't forget that. Lisa Meitner, who was a Jewish Austrian-Swedish woman, got out of Austria when Hitler annexed the country. She ended up in Denmark, much in part thanks to the Danish physicist Niels Bohr, another important person where the development of the atomic bomb is concerned. He told the Allies in 1941 that his former student, Heisenberg, was helping the Nazis to make the bomb. Bohr had to flee Denmark when the Nazis occupied it. He was stuffed on a British bomber named the Mosquito in the middle of the night and taken to England. There was also trouble for the Austrian-born physicist Otto Robert Frisch, the last of the four that developed nuclear fission and a man who later figured out how to detonate the atomic bomb while working on the Manhattan Project. A Jew, Frisch moved to England and later secured himself British citizenship. As you can already see, this was a strange time in human history. Scientists did a lot of moving about, sometimes not by choice. Many went to Britain, where Robert Oppenheimer would be for a few years. But today's show is not all about Oppie. It's about a lot of brilliant scientists, including a French trio who proved once and for all that you could create great power from a nuclear chain reaction in their paper in Nature on April 7, 1939. Every reaction, they said, would generate 3, possibly 4 neutrons, which would create more fissions. Boom! They filed 3 patents, including patent number 445686, titled Perfectionnement au charge explosif, which was the first patent in history for an atomic bomb. That same year, Szilard had written to the Italian-American physicist Enrico Fermi and told him about the possibility of the atomic bomb, to which Fermi replied, "Nuts." Fermi became known as the architect of the nuclear age. In 1942, he created the world's first nuclear reactor, the Chicago Pile 1. So, there were all these great scientists and lots of theories, and now there was a very realistic possibility of making a bomb with a power that could potentially end worlds. But the bomb was still a long way off from becoming a physical thing you could drop on a city and incinerate a good chunk of the population. It's one thing writing about a theoretically possible time machine. It's another thing sending volunteers back in time to fight a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Still, they knew the bomb was possible. That year, Heisenberg secured funding from the Nazis for the development of a nuclear reactor. Heisenberg, who you'll hear about a lot today, was never going to leave Germany. That fact alone caused the world outside of Germany to panic, not just the scientific world either. On May 5, 1940, a journalist named William Lawrence wrote in the New York Times that the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics had pretty much been turned into a uranium research center. Lawrence said 5 or 10 pounds of uranium would be able to create vast power, enough to drive an ocean liner. He explained the Nazis had an atom smasher, a particle accelerator, the greatest discovery in modern science, and that the Nazis could somehow use this great power in the war. He said 1 pound of uranium-235 at $25,000 a gram could create the explosive power of 15,000 tons of TNT, leaving a 300-foot crater in its wake. Much to the consternation of readers, he added that every German scientist had been ordered to drop all other research and devote themselves to this work alone. It sounded like the Nazis might become the first country to create a power source to end all wars. Was that true? It can't be ignored in this show today. It played a big part in why the Americans soon got very busy with their own atomic bomb. But it must be said that Lawrence was not the first or the last mainstream journalist in the US who was a government-sponsored propagandist. A few years after he wrote that first atomic piece for the Times, he told the world via the same newspaper that the horrific and torturous radiation sickness in Japan from those atomic bombs wasn't actually real. He knew it was, and he was being paid to say that by the War Department. This is important. Lawrence parroted what the U.S. Army, through the Manhattan Project's Leslie Groves, told Congress, that dying from radiation was actually a very pleasant way to die. They said just a few thousand had died, not mentioning they were almost all civilians. The truth got out, but the American military said it was Japanese propaganda. So, when Lawrence told Americans years before that the Nazis were flying in their atomic bomb research, was he exaggerating? According to some, he was a military mouthpiece, a Pulitzer Prize-winning master of misinformation working for one of the U.S.'s most well-respected papers. Was he lying so the U.S. Army would receive more funding for atomic research? Or was he telling the truth? A Soviet professor at Yale University read the article and word got back to the Soviet Union. Stalin, who'd murdered a good chunk of his best scientists in his paranoid purges, took notice. The Soviets needed that explosive power, and they too had some of the best scientists in the world, despite the recent diminishment of their numbers. The race was on. Pity Stalin had murdered good scientists, but the Nazis weren't much better. In the 1930s, when Hitler spread his noxious wings over Germany, the Nazis were applying their unique take on affirmative action in the German workplace. Politics got in the way of work. It wasn't always the best people who landed the best jobs. It was the Aryan people. Hitler certainly didn't back Jewish scientists, even though they were often the best scientists. Back then, an SS journal said Heisenberg was a white Jew and called him the Ossietzky of physics. Karl von Ossietzky, who would win the 1935 Nobel Prize for Peace, was charged with treason for writing about Germany's secret rearmament plan. He was imprisoned and later sent to a concentration camp. You couldn't get much worse than him in the Nazis' eyes. So the brilliant Heisenberg, Germany's best bet for an atomic bomb, was not a popular man. SS leader Heinrich Himmler ordered an investigation of his political beliefs, which went on for an entire year. At the SS headquarters, Heisenberg wasn't beaten up, but when he saw a sign on the wall of his interrogation room that read, "Breathe calmly and deeply," he knew the room had seen some horrors. This would affect his whole outlook on the Nazis, but he still turned down the opportunity to work at Columbia in the US when he had the chance before the war. Heisenberg could breathe a sigh of relief when a directive from Himmler stated, "We cannot afford to lose or kill this man. He was too important to science." Szilard was by then totally convinced that with enough fissile material the bomb could be made. He saw that explosion he imagined back in London as a reality. He'd also really been shook up by the fact that the German nuclear physicist Siegfried Flügge had just published 2 articles on exploiting nuclear energy. Flügge would soon be part of what he and other German physicists called the Uranium Club, where they would discuss the Uranmaschine, the uranium machine, aka a nuclear reactor. The Germans, it seemed to Szilard, were on the ball, even maybe ahead. Szilard talked this over with some other physicists and came to the conclusion that he absolutely had to warn the US president. That's the reason Szilard went to the Nobel Prize winner Albert Einstein, who was then working at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. He asked Einstein, who was about as big a name as you could get in this golden age of physics, to write to President Franklin Roosevelt a message dictated by him. Einstein agreed. The missive he put his name to has gone down in history. It's now referred to as the Einstein-Szilard letter. On August 2, 1939, he wrote, "To F.D. Roosevelt, President of the United States, White House, from Albert Einstein, Old Grove Road, Nassau Point, Peconic, Long Island. The President of the USA, of course, doesn't open fan mail when he gets up in the morning." The scientist had enlisted the help of the economist Alexander Sachs, who had access to FDR. In the opening paragraph, he told FDR that the element uranium may be turned into a new and important source of energy in the immediate future. Einstein, Szilard, said quick action was necessary after what the French team had just done in France and what Szilard and Fermi had done in the US, which was cause a nuclear chain reaction in a large mass of uranium by which vast amounts of power could be generated. He then used the kind of language that might cause a frisson of fission-related fear in the president. This phenomenon would also lead to the construction of bombs, and it is conceivable, though much less certain, that extremely powerful bombs of a new type may thus be constructed. A single bomb of this type, carried by boat and exploded in a port, might very well destroy the whole port together with some of the surrounding territory. He did admit, though, that such a device might be too heavy for a plane to carry. Oh, how quickly they'd change their minds on that part. He advised the president to bolster the budgets of scientists in this area because Germany was repeating the work the Americans were doing in their labs at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. Einstein said large amounts of uranium was needed, and the kicker, he explained, was that large amounts could be found in the Belgian Congo, now accessible by Hitler. We should add that this also had come as a shock to Einstein. Earlier in July, Szilard and the Hungarian-American theoretical physicist Eugene Wigner had driven Wigner's car out to Long Island. Wigner, who'd also once worked at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, was Jewish, although he hadn't gone to America because of the Nazis. He was there before their rise to power, when he'd landed a cushy job at Princeton. He now knew that he might not be going back to Germany, and he also knew that the Nazis had at their disposal some excellent scientists who were probably working on some kind of atomic bomb. The story goes that when they told Einstein about how such a bomb could be made, he looked at them startled and said, "Daran habe ich gar nicht gedacht." I did not even think about that. Of course, they all spoke German. In fact, their original draft of the letter was full of spelling mistakes. Before he got the letter, the president had been told about the possibility of a massive bomb with the power to take out large parts of cities, but his scientific experts had assured him that it was unlikely it could be made. It wasn't until October that FDR replied to Einstein. To say he was a busy man would be a massive understatement. The Nazis had invaded Poland in September. The world was about to change. FDR told Einstein in the reply that he would form a board and investigate the matter of this super powerful bomb. Einstein would years later call signing that letter the one great mistake of my life. Then the British added to the urgency when a team in England working under the Austrian physicist Mark Oliphant at the University of Birmingham wrote a paper outlining the first calculations regarding the size of the critical mass of fissile material needed to make the atomic bomb. Poop just got more real. This became known as the Frisch-Peierls Memorandum, named after the scientists that had come up with the calculations, Otto Frisch and Rudolf Peierls. As you know, Frisch was a Jew and elected to become British. Peierls, who'd once worked under Heisenberg, did the same. Like FDR's American advisors, British scientists hadn't initially thought the bomb was possible anytime soon, but that soon changed after Frisch and Peierls did some calculations and came to the conclusion that, actually, you could make a super bomb that could produce a temperature comparable to that of the interior of the sun, and with it destroy life in a wide area. And the worst part, the bomb would not have to be huge. It could weigh as little as a few kilos, so dropping it from a plane could certainly happen. 1 to 10 kilograms, they said. And you could have the power of thousands of tons of dynamite. Damn, did the Germans already know this? That information was the reason for the secret British MOD Committee, which researched further and eventually became the Tube Alloys Nuclear Research and Development Program. The British kept this program top secret, even from the USA and many people in the country's government. Tube Alloys was actually infiltrated by Soviet spies, as was the Manhattan Project. We'll come to that soon, but just tell you for now that one of the men we've mentioned already today was an atomic spy. Prior to this, when Frisch and Peierls had figured out that extremely important part of the puzzle, Oliphant went over to the US to help the Americans with work on microwave radars. Without giving secrets away, he convinced American scientists that they really had to speed up their nuclear research. This apparently got back to FDR. Szilard wrote many years later, these foreigners should have been awarded a special medal for distinguished services, and that Dr. Oliphant would be the first to receive one. The Frisch-Peierls Memorandum played a huge part in getting that bomb made as fast as it did. The British were ahead at this point, and it seems they didn't want to share all their knowledge with the Americans. Vannevar Bush, who was FDR's scientific advisor, was behind Roosevelt writing to Churchill in August 1941 to suggest collaboration on the bomb. Churchill was weary of the collaboration at this point, especially as the US hadn't even joined the war yet. This all changed in 1942 when the UK sent a scientific mission to the US led by Wallace Akers, the director of Tube Alloys, to visit the US's S-1 committee, the precursor to the Manhattan Project. The Americans, it was now pretty obvious, were flying ahead, spending millions on R&D, whereas Britain was spending comparatively peanuts. Not long later, Michael Perrin, who was the Secretary General of Tube Alloys, admitted that the US will soon completely outstrip us in ideas, research, and application of nuclear energy. He said if Britain wasn't careful, the US would snub the UK, which is exactly what Vannevar Bush and the chemist James Conant advised FDR to do when Churchill proposed a collaboration. Churchill had earlier admitted, "We must face the fact that our pioneering work is a dwindling asset, and that unless we capitalize it quickly, we shall be outstripped. We now have a real contribution to make a merger. Soon we shall have little or none." After what had happened, FDR was very much within his rights to rebuff Churchill, but he didn't. He had earlier ordered that Britain should not be provided with as much information as before, and Britain had responded with a £50 million plan to build its own goddamned atomic bomb. But in the interests of the world, the two nations agreed cooperation was better. The Nazis had to be beaten at all costs. On August 19, 1943, the two nations signed the historic Quebec Agreement, adopting most of a five-point plan that Churchill had written up, which asked for the free exchange of information, to not use bombs on each other, and to agree only to use them on another country if they both agreed. Churchill also told FDR that the US would have full use of British commercial and industrial capacities under this agreement. many of the best British scientists went over to the US to work on what had already become the Manhattan Project, led by Robert Oppenheimer. A team of 19 scientists who worked on the tube alloys went to Los Alamos. Some of them were just what the US needed, including Chadwick, the head of the British team, Piles, Fuchs, and William Penny. The latter was a mathematician who tried to figure out the damage of the blast wave from the bomb. Niels Bohr went along later, as did some other Brits, some of them only returning home when the US signed the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, which restricted the UK and Canada's access to US nuclear technology. General Groves was not a happy man. He was very much against the collaboration, so at first he put the British scientists in limited roles so they wouldn't have access to the complete information. In the end, they had access to every department except plutonium chemistry and metallurgy. Spies were everywhere, he reckoned, and he was right. Klaus Fuchs of the British team was a spy, and he had access to top-level material. Though he wasn't spying for the Germans, but for the Russians. Before the Brits took Fuchs in, he'd been a communist, but so had many scientists back then. The Germans were actually quite a big thorn in the side of the Soviet Union where atomic research was concerned. On June 22, 1941, the official newspaper of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Pravda, announced the construction of the first powerful cyclotron, particle accelerator, laboratory in the Soviet Union for splitting the atomic nucleus. The Germans invaded the Soviet Union that same day. The scientists at the lab were all shipped out and their work was abandoned. There were bigger things to think about. Yakov Zeldovich and Yuli Khariton, who before had been working on uranium chain reactions, ended up being told to drop that work and concentrate on chemical explosives. Many great physicists in the Soviet Union were told to stop messing around with chain reactions and start doing what the army wanted them to do. Still, at that point, they didn't know how much the British and Americans had progressed, or the Nazis for that matter. Grigory Nikolaevich Flyarov, one of the best Soviet physicists who discovered something called spontaneous fission, noticed something weird when he did what he often did and read physics journals in English. No one was talking about fission anymore. He wasn't stupid or naive. Nuclear fission was the topic of the day. He guessed it had been made classified by the military. Flyarov had already had the idea in his head about an atomic bomb. Now he was sure one was being developed over the sea. It's believed it was Flyarov who told Stalin to start a Soviet atomic bomb project. The Soviets soon knew they were years behind and didn't have the uranium they needed to make the bomb. Still, they soon had the knowledge, lots of knowledge, thanks to Fuchs. Fuchs was offered money to spy, but he told the Soviets to keep their cash. He would spy for free, but only because he knew that the Nazis would possibly win the war, especially if they got their atomic bomb before everyone else. Fuchs, like many scientists at the Manhattan Project, believed that the Soviet Union and the Germans would both be capable of building the bomb sooner or later, and as the Soviets were allies, more power to them, thought Fuchs. Hitler was the enemy for now, at least. Some say he was just a commie, but others say he didn't want a world in which one country had all the power and then could blackmail other nations. Fuchs also knew that the Germans had large stocks of uranium needed for nuclear reactors. In fact, when the Red Army marched over the German border just before they occupied Germany, they took 40 scientists to steal what ended up being nearly 350 kilograms of metallic uranium. They also took all the paperwork related to atomic research. When they entered Berlin, they went straight over to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Physics and got what the British and Americans had wanted for years. After the Allies invaded Italy in September 1943, under the Alsos mission, attempts were made to get a hold of German atomic research information, not only because it might be useful, but also because they didn't want the Soviets to get it. The Brits and the Americans were also worried about Japan, since Japan was certainly no slouch when it came to physics. The Manhattan Project Intelligence Group came to the conclusion that Japan's physicists were as good as anyone else's. Japan did actually have cyclotrons, 2 of them, at the Riken Institute. Bunsaku Arakatsu, who'd worked under Einstein and Ernst Rutherford, started the EFGO project into nuclear territory in 1943. Japan was on the ball too, but their trouble was finding high-quality uranium. It looked for it in China, Burma, now Myanmar, and Korea, but in the end, Japan was just too slow. It was nowhere near making the bomb. Japan also never thought the Allies would be able to make it in time for it to change the outcome of the war. That couldn't have been more wrong. So under the Alsos mission, the Allies sought to find out as much as possible about Germany and Japan. But it was Germany that was the biggest threat. It had the best scientists, it could get uranium, or so the Allies thought, and it had Hitler, who'd boasted occasionally about Nazi superweapons. They were also concerned about chemical and biological weapons, which the Allies themselves were working hard to create. As you know, the Germans had their reactor, what they called their uranium machine. What they didn't have was all the best scientists, men who were now working on the Manhattan Project, thanks to the Nazis' hatred of Jews. Hitler went a step further by actually conscripting some major scientists to fight with the army when they could have been working on research. It was the physicist Kurt Deibner who was charged with investigating the military applications of nuclear fission. Heisenberg was not the only main man, but he had indeed before that calculated that nuclear fission chain reactions could very well be possible. According to Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, another major component of Germany's atomic research, there were close to 200 scientists in Germany in the early 1940s who understood the potential of an atomic bomb. In fact, it was only discovered in the 1990s that in the summer of 1942, Weizsäcker had filed a patent on the process to generate energy and neutrons by an explosion. Weizsäcker's name was also mentioned in one of Einstein's letters to FDR. Even so, Germany failed to coordinate its scientists in the war effort. There were many bright men working in separate labs all over Germany, but unlike the Allies, there was no sustained push to make the bomb. As you know, there was the Uranium Club, but that was certainly no Manhattan Project. It was nothing even like it. But were they still close? At a Uranium Club meeting at the start of the war, Heisenberg spoke about a possible atomic bomb, but something which would take at least 5 years to make. Later in life, he said, "I didn't report it to the Führer until 2 weeks later, and very casually because I did not want the Führer to get so interested that he would order great efforts immediately to make the atomic bomb." Heisenberg felt that Germany's efforts should be focused on winning, not on theoretical science. If he was telling the truth, that is. Despite what the Allies feared, the Nazi project to make the atomic bomb barely got off the ground. In terms of theory, sure, they knew what they were talking about. But all those scientists were working in different parts of the country and had no fixed agenda. They had no plan, and anyway, Hitler didn't see this imagined bomb winning the war for him. Just like in the Soviet Union, when push came to shove, Hitler ordered his best scientists to work on more pressing matters, mostly involving conventional weapons. Those that did take part in the research were often set back by rivalries and a battle to secure funding. This separated state of being made it extremely unlikely that they would ever have made a bomb during wartime. It might not have even been a part of their vision. In 1939, Heisenberg wrote to the German War Office and explained that the fission process can, on present evidence, be used for large-scale energy production. He added that the best way of building a reactor capable of this will be to enrich the uranium-235 isotope. He was sure about power production, but not about bomb making. He later wrote, "We were happily able to give the authorities an absolutely honest account of the latest development, and yet feel certain that no serious attempt to construct atom bombs would be made in Germany." Even so, in October 1941, Heisenberg wrote to Copenhagen to talk to his former teacher, Niels Bohr. Heisenberg later wrote, "We were convinced that the manufacture of atomic bombs was possible only with enormous technical resources." Bohr asked him, "Do you really think that uranium fission could be utilized for the construction of weapons?" Heisenberg said yes, probably, but only with great technical effort and a huge amount of resources. He later said that he thinks Bohr misunderstood him and took that to mean Germany was well on the way to making the bomb. As you know, Bohr later told the British that Germany was indeed progressing, which probably wasn't true. Bohr also thought that in that meeting Heisenberg was trying to get information out of him, but Heisenberg later denied this. He said he was trying to tell Bohr about the bomb, but how German scientists, indeed all scientists, should be against it. It's still debated what these two men said at that meeting. Still, the fear during the war that Nazis were very close to having weapons of mass destruction was a fantasy, a paranoia. But the Allies weren't to know that in a world of secrecy. They had no idea that when they were spending $2 billion, over $24 billion today, on the Manhattan Project, not to mention all that had been spent earlier on the earlier American and British projects, the Germans were spending a paltry $2 million, over $24 million today, on their atomic projects. Albert Speer would have known how far the Nazis had gotten during the war. He was Germany's Minister of Armaments and War Production and was handed 20 years at the Nuremberg trials in 1946. Once he got out of prison, he said that in all of his 2,200 entries in the protocols of his meetings with Hitler, they talked about nuclear fission once. Yes, one time. Speer said, "I was familiar with Hitler's tendency to push fantastic projects, by making senseless demands. Speer evidently didn't want to get Hitler started regarding world-ending bombs. Anyway, atomic talk was way above Hitler's pay grade. According to Speer, Hitler was uniquely brutal, but he was quite conventional where the battlefield was concerned. Heisenberg also later remembered having a meeting with Speer, who told him that he'd only get a little bit of funding. Speer later said, "I'd been given the impression that the atom bomb could no longer have any bearing on the course of the war." Then there were the famous Farm Hall transcripts, which tells us more about how much the Nazis had known. As you know, when the war ended, the Soviets and the Allies went after the Nazi scientists. The Allies still believed the Nazis were progressing with atomic bomb research and research into other weapons. They wanted them for their knowledge and expertise, but how much knowledge did they have? A group of leading German scientists after the war was whisked off to England under Anglo-American Operation Epsilon, while in Germany under Operation Big, equipment and materials were smashed, and research work was plundered. What the Soviets hadn't already taken, anyway. Under the US's highly secret Operation Paperclip, they even took Nazi war criminals if they were valuable in some way. About 1,600 German scientists went to work for America, just as many had gone to the Soviet Union for that same reason. Back to Operation Epsilon, what happened at Farm Hall in England was quite unique. It was meant to be the smoking gun in terms of finding out about German weapons of mass destruction, but it fell flat on its face. The Brits detained a number of those prominent Germans they believed had been working on the Nazi atomic bomb project. They stuck them in a farmhouse for around 6 months and bugged the place. Everything they said was listened to from July 3, 1945 to January 3, 1946. Surely, the Nazis were hiding some kind of Los Alamos somewhere, or so they thought. So they listened, and they listened, and they listened. Top scientists we've talked about today, such as Kurt Deibner, Otto Hahn, Werner Heisenberg, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, chatted to their heart's content. The transcripts of the conversations were only made public in 1992. Only about 10% of the conversations were transcribed, adding up to 24 reports, over 250 pages that were all sent to General Groves in 1946. Quite amusingly, one conversation went, "Deibner, I wonder whether there are microphones installed here." Heisenberg, "Microphones installed? Haha, oh no, they're not as cute as all that. I don't think they know the real Gestapo methods. They're a bit old-fashioned in that respect." Haha, indeed, Heisenberg. A revelation came when the Germans found out about the bombing of Japan, and they all seemed shocked. Some of them tried to figure out how the Americans had done it. The American physicist Jonathan Logan heard what they said and later explained that it was obvious the Germans in the Uranium Club had not known much about how to complete the bomb. When Heisenberg heard the news, he tried to understand how the bomb might have worked. He even attempted the calculation of critical mass, the smallest amount of fissile material needed to cause a chain reaction in an atomic bomb. Two of the best nuclear weapon physicists in the world at the time, the head of the theoretical division at the secret Los Alamos, Hans Bethe, and the father of the hydrogen bomb, Edward Teller, said Heisenberg made the same mistakes they had when they first tried to get to the bottom of the atomic bomb puzzle. The ensuing conversations about how the Allies did it, or if they did really do it and it wasn't just a lie that they've been told, showed that these men had not even been close to making the bomb. Some of the Germans said they were grateful they hadn't even tried, knowing what Hitler might have done. Others regretted Germany had failed. Hahn, who remember was a Hitler-loving chemist in 1933, said to the physicists, "If the Americans have a uranium bomb, then you're all second-raters." He also called the bomb an inhumane weapon, although he initially didn't believe it was true. He then told the other men that he'd once said to himself that all the uranium in the world would be better off at the bottom of the ocean. The physicist Horst Korsching acknowledged, "That shows at any rate that the Americans are capable of real cooperation on a tremendous scale. That would have been impossible in Germany." There was more talk about how they failed, and Weizsäcker said, "I believe the reason we didn't do it was because all the physicists didn't want to do it on principle. If we had wanted Germany to win the war, we would have succeeded." Hahn replied, "I don't believe that, but I am thankful we didn't succeed." Weizsäcker said at one point, "I think it's dreadful of the Americans to have done it. I think it's madness on their part." To which Heisenberg replied, "One could equally well say that's the quickest way of ending the war." The nuclear physicist Karl Wirtz said, "If they had made the bomb, we would have obliterated London but would not have still conquered the world, and then they would have dropped them on us." That would make Wirtz one of the first Germans in history to talk about MAD, mutually assured destruction. Samuel Goudsmit, the scientific head of the Alsace mission, later said that the German effort at making the atomic bomb was ludicrously small-scale with the central group of labs looking like a few rooms in an old brewery. He added, to be sure, the laboratories were well equipped, but compared to what we were doing in the United States, it was still small-time stuff. Sometimes we wondered if our government had not spent more money on our intelligence mission than the Germans had spent on their whole project. For sure, input from captured and borrowed German scientists later helped the Soviets make their bomb so quickly, first test in August 1949. But as Heisenberg later said, under the conditions they were working, there's no way they could have gotten past the theory stage. They barely even tried to produce an actual bomb. They were just so far behind. Hitler didn't know the first thing about atomic weapons. He had no master plan involving an atomic bomb. His brutality was simple-minded. If there was a race to make a bomb, it was only completed by one side until the Soviets got wind of what was happening out in the American desert. That's not to blame Roosevelt for throwing tons of money at essentially a product that could kill everything he loved. He made the decision based on what looked like sound intel. And anyway, someone would have made the bomb had the Americans and their hodgepodge of multinational scientists not done it. In the real world, Eve always takes the forbidden fruit from the tree, and Pandora always opens that damn box. Curiosity is behind all of our triumphs and our tragedies, but we'd be dumb if we weren't so curious. Still, did the US have to drop those bombs? That's been debated for decades, with some people saying there was evidence Japan would have surrendered and that it was the invasion of Manchuria that pushed Japan to do what it did. In 1976, the US public learned that before the US let those bombs go, American and British combined chiefs of staff had written, "The increasing effects of sea blockade and cumulative devastation wrought by strategic bombing has already rendered millions homeless and has destroyed from 25% to 50% of the built-up area of Japan's most important cities. A conditional surrender might be offered by them at any time." Secretary of the Navy James V. Forrestal wrote in his diary that there was real evidence of a Japanese desire to get out of the war. Then in 1978, it was reported that in Harry Truman's diary, he'd written that the US had intercepted a message talking about a telegram from Japanese emperor asking for peace. Even Dwight Eisenhower, who later became president, said it wasn't necessary to hit the Japanese with that awful thing. There is still plenty of evidence that the Japanese generals were not going to give up, although Leo Szilard later said after he spoke with the Secretary of State James F. Burns, Truman's chief advisor, he was convinced that dropping the bombs was all about showing the Soviets what a great power the Americans had. When Szilard had that nightmarish vision at those traffic lights in London, the light turned green above him, and like a frenzied herd of grown-up children, humanity started thundering toward the horizon of world destruction. The light's been at amber since. Let's hope it stays that way. And indeed, we don't let the tragedy of scientific development outweigh the many great triumphs. Now, you need to watch a show about the Nazi medical scientists, the seawater torture, Nazi camp experiments, or look at this lighter show, why Hitler's nephew was his worst enemy.